Hello, if you can hear me, please comment, guys. Hello, hello. Hello. Hi, hello. 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 Cool, cool, cool. শোনা যাচ্ছে তাহলে? Cool. Acha. I'll just give it 2 minutes, and when everyone's here, I'll start. Yeah. Cool, cool. 2 minutes de manush ashuk. Yes, I am, Suresh. Yes, I am. The right kind. আচ্ছা, শুরু করি। শুরু করলাম, if this is okay. আচ্ছা, শুরু করলাম। আচ্ছা, so this lecture is going to be basically about structuring debates. The reason why I chose this issue is because I've been approached by at least 5 or 6 people, at least throughout pre-worlds or post-pre-worlds for NatCamp, because they don't know what structure is, and a lot of feedbacks have told them that the structure isn't correct. So this lecture will try to clarify my philosophy on structure and how to go about it throughout debates. So the first thing to clarify before getting into this lecture is, so for disclaimers, if I've coached you in some point in the past, you probably heard of most of these things. So if you're from Vikarnesa or if you're part of the Croatia WSDC team, this lecture is sort of useless. But yeah, like if you still want to watch, you can, I guess, if you want to. Yeah. Okay. The first thing to know about structure is, structure by definition is just organizing, which is to say how well and the process by which you organize your speech and present it in a debate. The first thing and the most important thing to remember is there is no one way of structuring speeches, which is to say I don't think everything I say is like a holy text from the Bible. You can agree with me, you cannot. I'm not saying everything I'm going to say in this lecture is the right way to do it or is the only way to do it. There are different people with different definitions of structure and different ways in which it works. So everything I say in this lecture is going to be my personal opinion of what works for me. I'm not saying it will work for you, and I'm not saying you should follow it, but you can and you might want to adopt certain parts of this lecture into your debating style. Okay. If that's clear, the first thing that I want to talk about is structure in general is no longer what we initially thought it was back in the day. So I'm not going to start talking about speaker roles in this lecture because everyone who's ever debated at some point in their lives has learned something about speaker roles. So the first time you go into a debate class in school, they teach you what a prime minister's role is, what a leader of opposition's role is. And they call that structure by saying the structure that a prime minister has to follow is 1.5 minute পর্যন্ত একটা objective দেওয়া লাগে, তারপর একটা model দেওয়া লাগে, তারপর you have to have 3 arguments that you need to flag post, and then after flag posting you need to analyze those arguments. 1 argument you give to your second speaker. These are the structures by definition of like specific things or specific roles that were taught. So the first thing to dispel is none of this is structure. These are prehistoric definitions of what speakers should do. Part of it still exists today. Most of it is no longer valid. I think, particularly speaking, structure is nothing to do with speaker roles. Structure exists in every aspect of debating. And that's the first thing debaters need to start adopting, which is to say, to fix your structure, you don't fix your speeches or you don't fix your speaker roles, you fix all aspects of debating. This means structure exists everywhere, from prep to speeches, of course, but within speeches, there are structures for different components of your speech. There are structures for arguments. There are structures for rebuttals. Everything is a structure that has to play a role, and all of these synergize will lead to a structured speech and a structured win for a particular team. Which means, if this lecture is to teach structure, it has to teach structure in different components of debating, and I'll try to do that throughout this entire lecture and try to cover the different aspects of it and how that eventually leads to a well-structured process of debating. Okay, so the first thing I said is, it's a flow process that exists in every part of debating, right? Which means structure has to start the moment at which you start debating in a round. And when do you start debating? As soon as the motion is out. That's the first point in which you need to start adopting structure. What this structure basically is structuring your prep. So obviously I'm not going to go into a detailed lecture of how to prep, because that can take another 2.5 hours as well. But in general, it's highly suggested that if I were to summarize prep in 30 seconds, prep is not 20 to 30 minutes of you thinking of arguments. It is 20 to 30 minutes of you creating a structure for the debate. So what is this structure? I think for every debate and every motion that you debate on, there are a few key questions that have to be answered. So for example, just for argument's sake, if I were to take a recent motion, I don't know, pre-world's final, which is this house believes that fear should be removed from the human conditioning, right? So if I were in prep, a few basic questions that would be asked in prep is, the first question is, okay, what is fear? Very basic question. Second question, what kind of roles does fear play in human conditioning right now? The ways in which it affects our decision making, the ways in which it affects macro society, the philosophical perspective of how it intermingles with other emotions. These are all sub-questions of a large structured question that is, what does fear play, or what role does fear play in our everyday lives? A third basic question probably is, in the absence of fear, what does the theoretical, hypothetical world that we don't imagine look like? I know these aren't necessarily the questions you will eventually present and state it exactly like this, but these questions are very important because they're the first step to structuring a case. The crucial distinction here is these 2 to 3 crucial questions that eventually create the framework of the debate has a huge role in your speeches and the rest of the debate. So the first step to structure and having proper structured speeches and proper structured debate is structuring your prep. And Shorodip can testify for this. Every time we've had messy preps, we've done terribly because our speeches become hard to structure if our prep is not structured and we don't know what we prepped on. And if you don't have a framework for all the arguments or all the analysis or all the contextualizations and characterizations you have, it doesn't really add as much value in the ultimate debate because it is about persuasion, and having persuasion needs structure. So the first thing to remember about structure is structure your prep time because it's very crucial for the rest of the debate. And if your prep is haphazard, the rest of the debate gets haphazard. Secondly, structuring your speech. That's the second component of structure. By the way, if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to ask. But I'll try to keep this as short as possible, but just generally speaking, if you still want to intermingle and stop me, ask at any point. All right, so after you've structured your prep, the next, in the flowchart of debating, the next thing that comes is speeches, right? So within speeches, which is whether it's the Prime Minister or the Leader of Opposition, I think the first myth is there's an overemphasis put by Bangladeshi school debaters on the different roles of different speakers. I'm not saying they're all the same. I'm not saying what the Prime Minister does is the same thing as what the government whip does. But there are a few basic things that have to be there in all speeches. And, okay, yeah, Akib bhai, quick question on prep structure. How important are notes taken during prep important to it? and to what level of detail. So I think this is very subjective based on, one, the team you're in. So I'll just give an example. When I team up with Shorodip or Ronak Bhai, neither of them ever take notes. I'm the one writing stuff down. So them not taking notes has a benefit because they can play a more free role in brainstorming while I play a bigger role in structuring. So if they come up with random examples, I can add analysis to it, I can frame it, I can structure it. And because I take more notes, I have a very structured thought process of exactly where the debate is. And I think that's particularly important if you go first, because you need to structure the debate. A bit more liberty can be probably afforded to people who are going later on, which means second speakers and third speakers, more so third speakers, don't have to write as much. Secondly, I do need to recall most things. I think my threshold for remembering is quite low, which means like, or high, I don't know, like, which basically means that although I may remember bits and pieces of analysis, I don't generally remember the different areas and issues. So this becomes particularly important in BP debates, especially if you're lower, because if you just generally discuss on a lot of things, it's very hard to remember all the things you discuss because of the multitude of ways in which debate progresses in different areas. So just having some idea of the general frameworks and the structures in which you want these discussions to happen is eventually a good thing. So even if you don't write micro level details of each structure, it's important to have that structure written down and the overall framework of it, because then you can fit in, say if you're in BP lower, your upper half into parts of the structure they already dealt with, and you can like sort of fill in the missing links. So already having that note in prep allows you to understand the flow of the debate and see what's missing. This applies to 3v3 debating as well if you're going second speaker. So if your prime minister has the responsibility of an argument, it's very hard to gauge exactly from the prime minister's speech which part of the flow process he's missing, because he'll make an attempt, especially in high quality debating, to at least seem like he's touching all parts. But if you have it written down in prep exactly what parts you discussed and what parts need to be discussed, it's a lot easier for a second and third speaker to compensate and understand exactly what's missing. So my suggestion is, do take notes to some extent. I wouldn't suggest taking 0 notes, but I obviously don't think that notes should sacrifice discussions to the point where, because you're so overburdened with taking notes, you forget about discussions altogether. Anyway, so these are discussions about prep. The thing we were initially discussing on was after prep in the flowchart of debating, the next thing that comes is speeches. So I think the first problem that people face is people overthink speaker roles to the point where they forget about the basics of what a speech is supposed to achieve and trade it off with what a speaker is supposed to achieve. What do I mean by this? I've seen multiple debates this pre-worlds where especially whips, either because they want to achieve what a speaker as whip does, overdoes the thing of, I have 3 clashes, and tries to name these clashes things that don't really matter, but things that they sort of want to include in these clashes, and then just list a bunch of rebuttals that don't really relate to the clash and don't really synergize, if that makes sense. Or the flip side, which is absolute disregard to what a speaker is supposed to achieve and just a random bunch of rebuttals because you want to win the debate. I think, especially in modern debating, the bridging gap between these two things is the prep structure. What this means is, in 80% of debates, even up to whip, the prep structure that you formulate, if you get the debate right, I'm not saying if the prep goes badly and your strategy is wrong, if your strategy is correct and you identify the debate correctly, the questions and compartments or structures that you identify in prep will eventually become the questions that are relevant within that debate. What this means is, there is no difference between what a prime minister and a whip has to do in terms of the structure of his case. So if in prep there are 3 areas of discussion, the prime minister should probably cover those 3 areas and say that there are 3 questions that I'm going to answer in my speech. The first, and then carry out a discussion on it. The second, and carry out a discussion on it. The whip's role, probably in debating, is also to show why those 3 questions are won by the side he or she is representing. So it is very unlikely that the prime minister's structure and the whip structure of the overall content and framework of the debate are going to be different. There will obviously be different bits of content based on how the debate progresses, but the overall framework will be the same. If it is different, that is the first sign that you either got your prep wrong or your prime minister screwed up massively. That's a bad sign. So the second part of structure is, as a team, in all speeches, it is very important that you answer questions that you identify are relevant to the prep. These questions will eventually make up the structure and framework of the debate, and if it is the correct framework, it will last till the end. Obviously, slight adjustments can be made, but the overall structure of the debate should, and you should make an attempt to keep it the same. The discussions and analysis obviously progress and are different. That's a different issue altogether. But these questions need to exist. So if I'm a second speaker, I should start my speech with these structures. If I'm a third speaker, my speech should be about these structures. And all speakers throughout the debate should attempt to add new analysis and new conclusions to these meta structures. So obviously, just a bit of suggestion, when you're prepping, don't make these structures based on arguments, right? Which is to say that don't make structures based on arguments that you think will win you the debate. These structures should be broad, such as to incorporate multiple areas of argumentation. So, for example, pre-World Semis motion, I think it was, criminal justice policy should be decided by technocrats over legislation, right? So, couple of frameworks. One, the current system is failing. So I think there are multiple arguments that you can talk about the different ways in which the current system of criminal justice policy setting is failing. It's not necessarily one argument. One could be political lobbyists and the ways in which they influence political parties and the nuances of that, the policies they affect. That's a huge argument in and of themselves. The way in which political incentives work, which is they often have campaign trading where senators help each other out. Often political campaigns are not run on criminal justice policy, and single issue voting is a big deal. All of these are arguments to say that legislators are very bad representatives of what people actually want. That's a current problem. So the structure for the question should be the kinds of problems that the current criminal justice policy setting faces. Second, how do technocrats function? What kind of characterize technocrats, how their decision-making process calculus works. The third structure probably is what kind of eventual conclusions are these technocrats likely to reach? What are the changes they're likely to achieve? This is very basic. Obviously, structures can be a lot more nuanced, a lot more, sophisticated. I'm just trying to give you a general basic idea of structures and how each of these structures can have different areas of argumentation. So the structure in all speeches should be the same. The Prime Minister obviously has his own arguments to fit into these structures. The second speaker can have different arguments. The third speaker should show why all those arguments will eventually lead to you winning those structures, if that makes sense. Okay, so what we've covered so far. Prep has to be structured. All speeches need to follow a common framework, and that framework is part of the structure of the speech. Now we're going to go into the third layer of debating, which is within speeches. Within speeches, I think, obviously there are different components for different speakers, but the general component, if I were to characterize, POIs will deal with this later because I don't think it's as important as the other stuff. I think the other things that, unrelated to structure, but would you say you'd filter these technocrats for political bias before selection? No, but I just say that I'd create a diversity, which means political biases cancel each other out. Like, I'd have representation from all ethnicities, races, so their political biases can eventually lead to a rational discussion, because you can't really have non-politically biased people because, all people live in a society, and even these technocrats want policies that benefit them. So obviously all human beings by some conditioning have some biases. I just create a model for diversity, which means biases cancel each other out, and that's likely to lead to a rational discussion because it's just the way technocrats discuss. It's unlikely to be one based on fear-mongering. It's unlikely to be one based on irrational, non-consequential, non-objective, subjective decisions. Okay, so what we were initially discussing. If I were to structure within speeches, the general thing, and this is keeping it as basic as possible, the thing that is common to all speeches in a round, or the things that are common to all speeches in a round, are rebuttals and arguments. There are things that you can do, like, obviously these are different, there are different strategies and different ways and styles of debating for different speakers. But one thing is definitely in common, which is, like, after structuring your overall framework of the case, you need to have arguments and you need to have rebuttals. This is as basic as it gets. Which means, I think the mistake that people often make is, they presume structure to be a thing for speeches and that's it. Which is to say, my structure has to be, at 2 minutes I'll start an argument, I'll finish it within 4, I'll start another argument at 4:30 after taking a POI, I'll finish it within 7, or something like that. And people don't really go deep into what these arguments are. And that's where it gets messy. And that's where the biggest complaints I feel in the school circuit especially for structure arises. Because although people structure overall speeches, they never structure arguments and they never structure rebuttals. Okay. If this is true, I think the way in which I'll proceed with the rest of this lecture is I'll tell you how I'll, like, some general suggestions to structure rebuttals, and then I'll give you a few general suggestions to structure arguments. So the first is rebuttals, purely because I feel like it comes in most speeches before arguments, even though PM probably has arguments first, I'll just deal with rebuttals first. Okay, so the first problem people face with rebuttals is, in debates, rebuttals happen after a speaker has spoken, which means most people are like, oh crap, that's a lot of matter. Someone is matter dumping from first speaker, a lot of stuff they've read, especially in a prep motion. How do I engage all of this? And what eventually happens in the school circuit is, at least in most debates I've seen, people start engaging everything, which is to say, oh no, you can't use that example. Russia doing this is stupid because I've read that Russia does something else. Here's a counterfactual. So this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie. All of what you're saying is untrue. We are likely to win because we have facts, or like just a random bunch of rebuttals to everything. This is problematic because this is the first step to having messy structure, which is you don't structure the beginning of your speech. Or this applies to LO and DPM and DLO, mostly. So I feel the first step to structuring rebuttals is, when you're writing material from your opposition, structure their case for them. So most debates, unless you're against good opponents, it's very unlikely to have nuanced, sophisticated structure in their argumentation coming from them. At least in Bangladesh. I presume most local tournaments in Bangladesh don't have debaters with proper structure flooding out arguments. Which means, if you are rebutting messy arguments messily, it's very tough to have a proper structure for yourself. What this means is, if your opponent isn't making an effort into structuring his arguments, you have to make an effort into structuring his arguments for him. So, what I do is, especially if I'm listening, like, general suggestion, don't talk amongst teammates when another speaker is speaking, listen to what he's saying. I have a habit of writing a lot of stuff down. So let's say I'm against Adi and Miraz dump a lot of matter, yeah? Like, they have some really, really good matter, most things I've never heard of, which I learned, like, in the debate then and there. And when Miraz is going first, he's talking about Middle East, he's talking about this, he's talking about that. On the face of it, it seems like they have a lot of matter. The first step to dealing with this is, when you go through your notes and everything you've written, ultimately, you can summarize everything into 2 or 3 ideas. Because all examples, and this applies to debaters like Akib Bhai who's watching, because he will dump the most number of examples you've ever heard in your life, some of which I highly question to be not true. But regardless, I can't disprove that because I don't know as much as he does. Which means, for every argument, he will have 15 examples. For every structure, he will have 15 different arguments. And what this means is, it becomes very tough to engage all of them. So the first step is, structure your opponent's speech by summarizing what the content they're dumping is. And usually, you can summarize all content within 2 to 3 generic ideas. These generic ideas, by the way, shouldn't be straw man. I'm not saying if they have good analysis, like, forget about the analysis, make it seem crappy, even though that works at world schools, that's not good debating. I'm saying summarize it into a general idea that can incorporate all those examples, all that matter. And then just say, okay, the LO that I just listened to has 1, 2, 3 ideas. This means for you to win the debate, you don't have to rebut everything the LO said, but just the summary of those 2 to 3 basic lines or basic ideas that you've compartmentalized it into. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily have to be one line. You can add a few nuances that you feel are important and relevant, but the general idea is make it shorter than it is and structure it for him. Second, so by the way, so what am I saying? The first step to rebutting is structuring your opponent's argument. Second step to rebutting, in your speech, mention this structure, which is to say, when you're rebutting, don't just randomly start rebutting. And Jubair does this a lot. Like, they said, da 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 da. We say, da 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 da. They said this, we say this. Not really the right way to go on about this, what I'm saying. What I mean is, first, just say, this is something that Sadbhai taught me from a young age. At the beginning of your rebuttals, just say, okay, if I were to summarize the opposition case, it can be broadly characterized under 3 frameworks. 1, 2, 3. I'll engage each of these constructively. This creates a basic structure for the rest of your rebuttals. Secondly, how do you break each of these basic structures? That's the second layer, which is, and this is something I don't know if you guys have heard of it. Most people suggest it. I think the suggestion is you have to rebut in multiple layers. One rebuttal is usually not enough to break something down, because for one rebuttal there's a counter rebuttal. For every argument or every summary or like idea that you like broadly summarize into, you should have multiple sets of rebuttals to every argument. Therefore, how do we characterize these multiple layers of rebuttals? Like, what are these multiple layers? Because people are like, I usually can't think of more than one rebuttal to one idea. So I have a couple of general ways in which you can rebut ideas in multiple layers. I think there are 4 broad ideas, or 4 broad ways in which you can attack ideas. First, attack the core assumptions of ideas. What does this mean? So for example, let's say there's a debate about, I think I discussed this in my lecture about principles. Let's say there's a debate about giving reparations to descendants of slaves, yeah? So the principle that can be run is, they suffer now, they suffer because they historically were deprived of property, they still suffer now, we should give this property back to them. And this was run by Akib Bhai very well in IUB Assertion. So the core assumption behind this idea is, property should be given to people who are suffering. So you attack this assumption by saying that not all descendants of slave owners are suffering, and a lot of people are suffering who are descendants of slave owners. So if your principle is, and the core assumption behind your principle is, suffering constitutes right to wealth, we should give this wealth to people that generally need it, and being the descendant of a slave owner is too generalized a criteria to do this. Second way of attacking ideas. Break the logical link between arguments, or like ways in which one thing leads to another. What this means is, and this happens very frequently in Bangladesh, I think I gave this feedback to Debo, especially Debo's team, Debo Alwasi and Turjo recently at Pre-Worlds. Arguments are not mechanized, which is to say, a lot of teams characterize problems and then they characterize conclusions. What this means is, so for example, there was a motion about something related to women in Pre-Worlds. I don't remember exactly. Women should be parents of women should be told to adopt male traits, right? That was a motion. So I think an argument or the general line of argumentation that I saw in that debate from Sunnydale was, these are the problems that women face right now. These are the ways in which women will be better off. So now they're suffering due to patriarchy, the kind of roles they're trapped into, etc., etc. If parents support this, the ways in which they'll be benefited is they'll gain confidence, they'll prioritize themselves, they'll get better jobs, they'll get this. See the problem with this? There's a problem, there's a conclusion. There's no mechanization of how to get there. So the second layer of attack is attack the mechanization process, which is, no, all these things are unlikely to happen because of the actors involved, the society, the role it'll play, the world itself is unlikely to change. So if you adopt male traits, you're unlikely to be the best you can be as a male, you're unlikely to be accepted within the feminist agenda, the ways in which you're likely to suffer, the way, to what degree your parents have control, will it really be successful? All of these are logical attacks to the link between the problem and the conclusion. That's the second layer of rebuttal. So the first was attacking the core assumption. The second is attack the logical link between arguments. The third and fourth are less powerful but quite crucial. The third is mitigate the impacts of arguments. So even if you can't attack the core assumption of arguments, and even if you can't break the logical link, these are some of the best debaters in the world. The third layer is you need to make the arguments seem unimportant by significantly mitigating the kinds of impacts that argument has. Which is to say, you can probably say, okay, Akib bhai, can moral higher ground fill in gaps in policy? Imperfect mechanism but urgent need. When you can't perfect your policy, is it smarter to try this? It is okay to try this. It isn't the best idea to try this. So obviously it differs from motion to motion. Some motions are hard to sell mechanistically because there is a moral high ground on one side, a lot of mechanistic backlash on the other. But I still think it is strategically important for the side with the moral higher ground to talk about some kinds of mechanization to which marginal impacts and marginal changes are characterized for the most vulnerable group, which in and of itself is a good thing. So even if you can't mechanize long-term meta impacts, at least you're mechanizing short-term impacts for the most vulnerable, and that brings in your higher moral ground into play. Which is to say, I don't think these are mutually exclusive things. You can sell your higher moral ground better by some kinds of mechanizations that eventually lead to fruition of that higher moral ground. Okay, how to structure note-taking. This is depends on what role you're talking about, depends on what kind of problems you currently face. I don't think I can answer. So my issue about note-taking is usually based on people to people. I have different suggestions for different people because note-taking is very personal. The way I note-take, no one else in this world really note-takes because it's very personal, and it's usually what happens perception-based. So we can have a discussion about this personally. You can note me about the kinds of problems you face, and eventually I'll give you suggestions based on it. I tried this with World Schools kids because I think every person has a different problem, especially if you're whipping. Whipping note-taking is a completely different ballgame altogether that is a huge mess. I'm not the best at it, but I have a few suggestions. We can talk about it later. Okay, so the third thing is you have to mitigate impacts and make arguments unimportant. So if there's an argument that says it helps A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, and all of these people are important, and these are the different categories of benefits these are likely to create. A way of mitigating impact is characterizing the context. Say, no, this is probably happening in a world in which is quite rather conservative, or a government that is unlikely to allow the proliferation of this, or these people are unlikely to accept it. So remove as many impacts as possible so as to make that argument seem less important in the debate. So in simple terms, this is called framing out of the debate, when you can characterize strategically that this argument is not as important as your opponents make it to be. Don't strawman, use incentives and use reasons. Always use reasons for why these impacts are unlikely to be true. Don't just assert it. That's the third layer of attack. The fourth layer of attack, and this is the worst case scenario, attack examples. Which is to say, if they have an argument with a crappy example, talk about your knowledge of that example and why that doesn't apply. Give multiple sets of counterexamples, which significantly, at least on a perception basis, reduces the impact of that argument in the judge's head. So what did I say? Summarize the structure of your opponent's case. Rebut each idea with these four layers: core assumption attack, logical link attack, mitigation attack, example attack. All of this should be structured in your speech. You should literally say that I have four responses to the first idea. The first is, the second is, the third is, the fourth is. And then, and this is the most important part, do not end it there and just move on to the next idea. Finish it with a comparative. Comparatives don't only exist in arguments, they exist in rebuttals as well, which means you should compare what the case is as of now after your rebuttal, or what the world is with that argument versus the ways in which you've characterized the attacks. So always add comparatives at the end of rebutting each argument. If necessary, add comparatives for every layer of attack. And after you've rebutted all arguments, add a comparative to overall case and why your overall case that stands from the opposition is not as strong as it was before you engaged. No, they're just interchangeable terms. I mean, like, you can, like, there are different terms for everything. Like, WIP has, like, there are different ways to characterize what WIP frameworks are called. They can be frameworks, they can be structures, they can be clashes, they can be questions, they can be points of contention, they can be points of engagement, issues of discussion. These are just different ways of using English. I would just suggest don't use common words, like don't call them clashes because, I don't know, they just sound lame to use. Frameworks is a cool way of making the same thing sound cooler. Yeah, so all of this is how to structure rebuttals. Structure exists in everything, meaning structure the ways in which your opponent characterizes his case, structure the way you attack it. For every layer of structure, add comparatives. For every rebuttal to one idea, add comparatives. For the finishing of rebuttals and before moving on to your arguments, add comparatives. All of this eventually helps build up to your overall structure and answer the questions you're trying to answer. Tie everything back to the framework you set in prep with the comparatives, if that makes sense. Okay. So I think that's how to like structure rebuttals. If you have any questions related to this so far, you can answer. Okay. The last is, how do we structure arguments? Again, just for like clarification, this is not the only way to do this. This is not necessarily the correct way to do this. These are just some ways in which work for me. They may not apply to you, but I'll still give you a couple of suggestions. Okay. The first thing, and by the way, I think there's a age-old structure for an argument which is AREL. I think I was taught this by Tanzil Bhai back in the day. It was quite an important thing back in 2014, where every argument has to have an assertion, a reasoning, and a logical link. I think arguments today are far more flexible, but these three things still exist. It's just that the assertion is a lot more nuanced. The reasoning has different categories. Logical link has 5-6 ways of doing it. So I'll just talk about the different ways in which all of that helps. And yeah. How do we exactly say so many things in time though? I mean, there wouldn't be much time left for arguments if we focus so much on rebuttal. Okay, so first, I think what I just did is saving you time because you would otherwise rebut everything the opponent says. This is easier and should take less time. Secondly, obviously a part of it is based on efficiency of phrasing, which is to say, I'm not saying I'm the most efficient, but I'm definitely a lot more efficient than I was 2 to 3 years ago. I don't use fillers as much as you normally would hear me a couple of years ago, because that's part of debating, right? Time efficiency. So obviously coming up with matter and covering them is a part and art of debating, and most debating will eventually be about that, because when we start debating, we can't reach 8 minutes because we struggle under timing. I think the problem most of us face now is we can't fit our matter into 8 minutes. So obviously practicing helps. But thirdly, this is based on the presumption that you will actually have 4 layers of attack to every argument and every idea. It's very unlikely. I mean, I'm just saying that obviously it's good if you do, but it's very unlikely that it will eventually happen. Usually rebuttals will end by 3 minutes. And if you spend 1 minute per idea, because I don't really expect you to engage to more than 3 ideas, I don't really think that it'll take much time. 1 minute is more than enough to finish 2 to 3 layers of rebuttal, especially if you're not repeating. Thirdly, time limitation is another reason where strategy comes in, which is to say, if an argument is not as important, you shouldn't spend much time engaging it. You should just mitigate the impacts of it, make it seem irrelevant, and spend more time attacking the more pertinent arguments of your opposition. That's where strategy of debate comes in as well. So these are just 3-4 reasons why all of that is actually quite crucial and part of the art of debating, and you will improve on as you progress. Okay. Yeah, just break. Yeah. Okay, so how do you structure arguments? For people who already follow the AREL method, I won't go beyond it, but I'll just say a couple of things. The first is, when making an argument, the first thing, even in the AREL process, is assertion. But the problem that debaters in Bangladesh face is, we use very generic phrases for assertions that don't really have much impact. What do I mean by this? I mean, so for example, in most debates, especially in even in the good rooms of schools, I think there are a few very generic assertions that end up making arguments. First, I'll give you principal justification. Principal justification isn't really a nuanced assertion. Or, this helps the feminist movement. It's a very lame way of asserting. Why is this the case? Because these kinds of assertions make your arguments seem very prone to rebuttal. What this means is, if you structure your speech with structure your argument with an assertion that is so generic, yeah, we help the feminist movement, it becomes very easy for the opponent to just say, no, we can also help the feminist movement. You're unlikely to help this branch of the feminist movement. And for a judge, if your assertion is helping the feminist movement and the opponent disproves you and mitigates the ways in which you do, your argument starts having less and less value. Therefore, the first way in which you have to structure arguments is having very strategic ways of asserting those arguments. How do you create strategy? So obviously a lot of it is down to experience, but most of it is based on the conclusion you're trying to draw and preempting attack from opposition. What do I mean by this? So, let's say there is an argument about, let's say a very basic argument, which is to say, rich people should donate money to the poor, right? Obviously, there's a shit ton of arguments about colonialism, injustice, arbitrariness, the ways in which they benefit, the ways in which capitalism benefits these people, yada, yada, yada. But a very basic argument is, they're in a unique position to help, which is to say, you can tag and because they're rich, no one else is rich, they're in a unique position to help, they should help. So a very basic assertion is, rich people should help the poor because they have a moral obligation to do so because they're in a unique position to help. The problem is, this is not the most strategic because although it sort of indicates they're in a unique position to help, it doesn't strategize and mitigate attack from opposition to say that it doesn't matter. What a strategic framing for the same argument probably would be, the only people that you can, if there was an argument, the argument would be, the only people that can help the poor are the relatively privileged. And in the absence of their help, they are likely to suffer. So the assertion is, these are the only people that can help, which is uniquely different to they're in a unique position to help. So opposition can just come up with different people who are in unique positions to help and mitigate it. But if you characterize and make sure that your assertion is that they're the only people that can help, opposition has to come up and disprove that for your argument to not stand, rather than just mitigate it. That's one. Second, assertions intuitively automatically lead to you tying back your analysis to that assertion. What this means is, because so let's say you run a generic assertion, we help the feminist movement. Every layer of analysis, even if you make the effort to tie back, will just be yeah, this is how we help the feminist movement. This is how we help the feminist movement. So the tiebacks are quite weak. This allows you to have a strategic outline by which you can continuously frame back to different ways in which they're the only people that can help. That's one strategic way of framing this thing, right? So the first layer to structuring argumentation is, the assertion has to be strategic. And it obviously is something that you learn with experience and learn with a lot more debate experience. but it's something that has to preempt attack from the opposition. That's the first. Second, every argument should not be narrow. And I'm a firm believer in not making arguments for the sake of making arguments. Arguments should be broad and should have different compartments. If it is a time process argument, which is a policy argument, that these are the kind of things that are likely to happen, there should be different components within that argument talking about the different parts or phases in which that mechanization process happens. And each of these components should have their own name or should have their own tagline or just a general indication of what this means. So for example, if there is an argument about intervention, if there's a debate about intervention, a common argument is post-war recovery or post-war reconciliation. I think people think that they're structuring their case by talking about war, before war, during war, after war, and post-war reconciliation itself is after war. The problem is, even within post-war reconciliation, it's a long and mechanized process. So you need to talk about the different components of post-war reconciliation, have it in different components. So probably the first phase is absolute recovery from post-war, like what happens right after the war. So if it were 1971, what happens in 1972? If this were World War II, what happens in the Allied countries right after the World War II ends? That's a first component. Second component, what are the likely changes, the likely outcomes going to be in the midterm or like somewhat? So whether these are economic policies that you start implementing, whether these are foreign policy or trade relationships that you're starting to build. What is the long-term outcome? Are UN peacekeepers going to be there for the longer run? What kind of stakeholders are likely to come into political office? What kind of powers they're likely to have? What kind of systems of structures or institutions are likely to be within this country? So even within post-war reconciliation, if you have an argument, there has to be different components that phase it out. If it's a mechanistic argument, if it's a purely principle and philosophy based argument, it should have different components about the premise behind that philosophy. So an argument say the pre-world's final motion, fear should not exist in human conditioning. So an argument probably is this ruins the ways in which the human mental calculus works or the human decision-making process works. So this has different components. First, what is the human decision-making calculus as of now? So it is influenced by different emotions, some of which are value neutral, some of which are negative, some of which are positive, some of which vacillate between both. So fear is an emotion that is objectively negative. You can characterize this. A lot of other emotions like anger have vacillate between positive and negative, and therefore you can call it value neutral. So for example, anger has its bad sides. Anger can make you drive to the good. So this is the mental calculus as it is now. First component. Second component, to what extent does fear influence this mental calculus? You can characterize. Third component, in the absence of fear, what is this mental calculus likely to look like? Fourth component, is this mental calculus a right mental calculus or a justified mental calculus? Is it a value we like to protect? So even within arguments, you need to set up components, layer those components, ask questions within those components, and have analysis for them. That's the second. Third, this is, okay, so argument assertion. Different components within arguments, going into each component. You can obviously analyze components with stories and rhetoric and like paint the entire analysis as a story. The problem is we are Bangladeshis, which means stories sound way too rhetorical and very unanalytical, especially coming from a brown man's voice. What this means is there are very few debaters that I've seen sell stories well instead of layers. Warish was one of them to some extent. I think Wasifapu does it to some extent. But very few Asian debaters get away with selling a complete story rather than setting up layers. So even within compartments, I'd suggest the best course of analysis is having layers for each component and saying, okay, so this component is likely to have 2 to 3 layers, add analysis for each of those layers, step 1, step 2, or like importance, and like layer each component. And that eventually makes your entire argument a lot more structured, because there's an assertion, there are components, and each component has clear, distinct processes and clear, distinct ways of analyzing that eventually help make that argument important. the last part of structuring arguments is, and this is the part that most people miss out on, after doing all of these things, I think the one thing people miss out on significantly is, okay, so what? All of this mechanization happens. Why is that important? And this is the part where you either tie back or make things important. So, very general question that I've heard is, yeah, so I know that you want me to make arguments important. How do I do this? Because most people are lost because they're like, okay, I do layer, I do compartmentalize, I do structure, but then the complaint is I don't tie back. And prime ministers face this complaint a lot. How do I make an argument important? So at the end of finishing these compartments and having comparators for each, I think there are a couple of ways to make this argument seem important. The first is, make your argument seem like it applies in different contexts or applies in all contexts. What this means is, the more narrow the contextualization of the argument is, the less important it is. So if you're running a feminist argument solely for developing countries, it is less important than an argument that can apply to different contexts and different kinds of countries. So make an effort to make your arguments seem like they can apply in different contexts, and that in and of itself adds brownie points, and explicitly state at the end of your argument, this argument is important because it applies regardless of context. Secondly, show that your argument has no other alternative, which is to say, yeah, all of these things can be achieved, but a probable op attack is, here are other ways in which these things can be achieved, therefore your way of achieving it is not important. The way to tackling this is, show that there are not as many other ways in achieving these things, and therefore this is the right way to go on about it. The third way to make your argument seem important is characterizing the stakeholders it affects and saying that the stakeholders it affects are probably the most vulnerable in the debate. Very easy way to do this. So, like, most of it is done on rhetoric, like poor people, women, or like Muslim women living in Pakistan are the most important vulnerable group. So your white liberal feminists getting jobs in the US are not as important. Very easy rhetorical way of framing. The fourth is just pure framing and rhetoric, which either connects back to the initial assertion or, like, this is something that obviously I can't teach right now, but there are ways in which you can frame things to be important. So for example, there's a very common feminist debate that eventually leads to, do I want traction at the cost of sacrificing the quality of the message, or do I want quality of message with less traction? So a way of framing why traction is important is saying that it's and Mifzal did this at Worlds very well, like, it is the 21st century where people have limited attention span and people barely watch advertisements, and we have too many things to worry about. And a lot of these feminist issues are things we just don't believe exist, like microaggression. So the only way in which we will ever believe these things to be true is if we can get a celebrity or get some ad or like message that sensationalizes and creates traction within us. So that is a way of framing that this argument is important, because the way in which the world has like moved on is one in which this occurs. So if I were to summarize everything that we've discussed, and this is probably like the overall lecture I've had so far, structure has to exist in everything and in all parts of debating. It is there in prep, it is there in your overall speech, you have to frame your speech or like create frameworks within your speech. It is there in rebuttals, it is there in argumentation. I've given you different strategies and different ways in which all of these things can be done. I'm not saying that these are the only ways or the correct ways. There are different ways in which different people adopt debating. These are ways in which have helped me. I'm not saying these are all the ways in which this can be done, but this is one way in which it can be done. So hope this helped. So I'll start answering questions from now. If you have questions, I don't really have more material to talk about. Like, obviously we can go on and on and on, but it's never ending. But this is a general idea. If you have questions, put them into the comment link. Okay, so first question from Lauren Toyeb. For upper houses in BPs, what's a good way to cover a lot of ground? Like, is there a thought process I should adopt that help me cover more? Not talking about matter dumping or barraging with lots of examples, just covering ground in terms of... So I think the basic idea is create frameworks within prep and try to cover those frameworks. Secondly, it is impossible, especially against good lower half opponents, to cover everything. So more effort has to be put in, especially in prep, to making the areas you cover seem important. So even if they come up with different areas of debate, the fact that you've put in effort into making your argumentation or making your areas of debate important automatically gives you more impact. And they have to compare their importance to yours. Whereas if you don't make your argument seem important, it's a lot harder to win the debate, especially from upper half. So I don't think the idea is to cover as much ground. Yes, it is, obviously. And to do so, just create a proper framework. If you can create a proper framework, it automatically brings in a lot of analysis. Even if you can't cover it in PM, by the time your DPM speaks, a lot of it will be covered. Secondly, put a lot more effort into making your frameworks important. So even if there's a different area of debate unexplored, it doesn't seem as important. Okay, Turjo. Could you tell me about 3v3 second speaker structures? Does it have to be rebuttals first and then a new argument as wanted in WSDC, or even just making comparisons with this one? Okay, so the reason, okay, so how do I do this? Again, there's no proper answer to this, but yes, there definitely has to be rebuttals. Yes, there definitely has to be new material. The problem with WSDC is it's a very trashy form of debating. So the kinds of burdens they put on you are not necessarily the most important. If you want me to answer in general terms, second speakers don't always have to come up with new conclusions. They can come up with new bits and pieces of analysis, package it differently, and just frame their speech through questions and use questions. Like we do that all the time, especially in BP. Ostros, it works to some extent too. I don't think it has to be rebuttals 3 minutes, arguments 5 minutes. It can just be questions, a series of questions. The questions can have rebuttals and arguments integrated. That's a very important and strategic way of debating that has occurred now, where rebuttals and arguments aren't mutually exclusive things. They're integrated, and you can do that as well. I'm not saying that, and that's actually a more structured way of second speaking, in my opinion. For WSDC, yes, I do think there is a burden of coming up with a new argument, but here's my take on it. I don't think you should make an argument for the sake of making an argument. What I'm saying is, don't make an irrelevant, less important argument just for the sake of making it. My philosophy is, don't make arguments unless they win you debates. Because even if they give you speaks, who gives a shit? Because they won't win you debates. So if you want second speaker material and there's a new argument that you don't think is important, my suggestion is, use analysis that your first speaker has missed out on, create a different assertion or a different context or a different group that it targets, use new analysis and the general logic of your first speaker and just come up with a new argument. It's fine. You can make it seem important in different ways and like different analysis, but like it will seem like a different argument even though the logic of it is the same. And that's fine. It's basically what lower halves do a lot in BP, where we package upper half material and make it seem different. You can do that as a second speaker, and it does seem like a different argument. So my philosophy is, even at WSDC, yes, although you need to make a new argument, don't make a new argument for the sake of making an argument. Make a good argument. Jubair ibn Hamid, bhai, how do I speak to get more debates at WSDC? I don't know, speak better, I don't know. Abra Farhan Zaman, suggestions for structures of reply speeches. If I recall correctly, Adi bhai mentioned summative weighing years ago. Okay, so it's in my head. It's essentially a whip speech with nothing new. That's it. If I were to summarize a reply speech, a whip speech tells the judge with material why you should win. A reply speech reminds the judge why you've already won. So a whip can add new analysis, can add new rebuttals. A reply has those same basic questions and frameworks that you set up in prep, by the way, or has been made throughout the debate, but just reminds the judge that, okay, these arguments have been made, these rebuttals have been made, this is why we win, this is why this is more important than something else. Everything that has already been done, reminding the judge of it. So note-taking strategy is a very large concept of exactly what you mean. Like I can start from the kind of paper I use, the kind of pens I use, the ways in which I write for different speakers, the ways in which I write as first, as second, as third. So I don't know what this means, but the general idea is yes, you definitely do have to listen. You shouldn't talk because like you'll miss out on a lot of important things. But I would suggest don't be afraid to take a lot of notes, which is to say, if you feel like you as a speaker need more notes, take more notes. Take 15 papers to the podium, it doesn't matter. No one judges based on how much, like even if you give a 78 speech without any paper being used, like just use 20 pages on the podium and give a 79 speech, right? Like, doesn't matter how much paper you use. So it's obviously based on comfort. I write a lot, in my opinion. I do write quite a lot because I'm quite the heavy note taker. I am a firm believer in always having a backup in case I forget something. Yeah. Any more questions? I guess not. I guess that's it. Hope this was useful. Thank you for listening. How to improve handwriting? I mean, like, go somewhere and learn how to write. I don't know, man. If your handwriting is really trash, I'd suggest use different colors so your notes don't get muddled up. You know what's more important than the others. You can segregate rebuttals and arguments and stuff. Can you recommend any videos where a debater used a story instead of layers for us to watch? I don't know if you guys know Chris Bissett. He never layers anything. He's probably one of the best debaters of history. He was in he debated for Australia. He was in Monash in Sydney as well. He has the record for Worlds, 26 out of 27 points. So you can go to HWS Round Robin 2012 final. You can go to Chennai Worlds. Watch any video, like Chris Bissett, any video, Chris Bissett. Yeah, just YouTube Chris Bissett. Yeah, like Chris Bissett is a classic example of how you don't need layers to be an amazing debater. Like, he has zero traditional forms of structure, but my God, what a speaker. Yeah, he's a machine. Anything else, guys? CHRIS space BISSET. Chris Bissett. Yeah, I guess. How do you spell what? I don't know, man. Like, you said, how do you spell that? I thought you said how to spell Chris Bissett. I don't know. What am I not getting? I don't know. Regardless, I guess that's it. No one really has questions. I hope this was useful. I mostly did this because 6 or 7 people were asking me the same question at the same time. I didn't want to duplicate effort. Hope this comes in handy. Good luck, guys, especially for those in camp. Like, gear up for camp. See you soon. Yeah, good luck. Bye.